Psychology. We're going to do a little series here on gender identity and gender diversity. Gender is complicated. I would know. I'm transgender. Hello, I'm Cora. I'm Dr. Cora Sargent. I'm an educational psychologist and a senior teaching fellow. And alongside the legendary, my longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Sarah Wright, we run what we lovingly term the EP Gender Research Group. Now, our little gender research group usually has about 8 trainee educational psychologists in it at any one time. And a lot of our trainee educational psychologists have now gone on to become fully fledged EPs in the world and have published their research. Most of them. We, as members of the EP Gender Research Group, help our trainee educational psychologists to run their doctoral thesis research on gender diversity in some way. Often on LGBTQIA+ issues more broadly too, but very often on gender diversity specifically. And the reason that we do that is because there's a real need to. We, as a community of scientists globally, are developing an amazing understanding of gender that we've really never understood before. I got into this gig 10 years ago when I was a trainee educational psychologist. I couldn't do my thesis research on gender diversity for 2 reasons. 1, because I couldn't find a supervisor. And 2, because there wasn't a big field of literature to sit into. We were still kind of coming out of our sort of social cognitive view of gender, and we were entering into some new understanding of what gender is and can be, but it wasn't really a super popular topic for research. In the last 10 years, however, there has been a massive explosion of research, both in the UK, in the US, and around the world. Legends like Christina Olsen, like Céline Goulgos, like us here in the UK. Amazing researchers all coming together to try to understand gender diversity in some way. I don't position us alongside legends like Christine Olsen and Céline Goulgos. They are legends in the field. But maybe, just maybe, we get to contribute in some small way to that growing understanding. And that growing understanding cannot come at a better time. In the US right now, you may have seen that we seem to be experiencing something of a contraction of transgender rights in Florida, in South Dakota, and most worryingly in Tennessee. Not because it's Tennessee, Tennessee's great. Not because it's Tennessee, but because the nature of the law in Tennessee is quite specific in that in a year it sets out legislatively how young people below the age of 18 will no longer be able to legally access transition-related healthcare. And it sets out how they will be expected to detransition. Now, that might all be a bit confusing to you if you are new to this field. You are very welcome here. We're going to cover all this in some detail and try to help to understand what's going on here and what it all means. To start with, we need to understand what happens for young trans kids in Tennessee, right? Let's say that you are 16 years of age in Tennessee. When you were 12, your body started to differentiate. Let's say you are a girl in the world in all the ways that matter. All the ways that matter. You are sure, you've always been sure, you are insistent and consistent and persistent in your understanding of yourself as a girl in the world. But doctors assigned you male at birth because we have a pretty strong model of gender in our society, in Western society in particular. A strong model of gender that says there's only 2 genders in the world, male and female. And whichever you are can be accurately determined at birth by looking down. And so when you were born, you didn't have a choice. You were too young, and doctors looked down and they said, well, congratulations, parents, it's a boy. And so you were raised as a boy in the world, as best parents could, but you always knew yourself to be different to that. And let's say you hit 12, your body is at risk of differentiating in a way that's unpleasant if you're a girl in the world. I know because I went through it. I went through a male puberty when I was, a teenager in the UK. I watched as my Adam's apple grew, as my voice deepened. And as you can hear, it's actually quite difficult to undo the voice deepening once it's taken place. I watched as my facial hair grew. I watched as my shoulders broadened, as my fat redistribution happened, and I got a chiseled jaw. I watched as I got a bit more musculature. I watched as all the girls around me became women, young women in the world, and I was becoming a man. Now let's imagine that you were fortunate enough to get access to transition-related healthcare. It's a privileged group that get access to it. Let's imagine that you were able to take puberty blockers to prevent you from going down that male puberty, many of the effects of which, as you can hear, are difficult to undo. And then let's say that you reached 16 and you gained access to, a puberty that was right for you. Years and years of contemplation and thinking about it and consideration has led you to make the decision, now that you're a bit older, that you want to go down a female puberty. And so maybe you're lucky enough that doctors help you. You go down a female puberty at 16, and then the law changes. Next year, this law will come into effect. If you stay in Tennessee, you'll have to detransition. Not only do you have to stop taking the puberty, facilitating drugs that allow you to go down a female puberty, but your body will continue to produce masculinizing hormones and you'll go down a male puberty. Can you imagine being forced to do that? I really can't. I experienced it. I wasn't forced to legally, but got to bear in mind that when I was that age, there were no transition-related health services for children, young people in this country. There was just nothing for me to go to. Certainly, there weren't puberty blockers. Certainly, I wouldn't have had access to them. And you might have seen across the world, we are seeing this kind of contraction happen, not only in terms of transition-related healthcare in the US, but also, in the UK in terms of transition-related healthcare. You might have seen reports, transgender adults have to wait an average of 6 years for first appointment now for transition-related healthcare. That's bananas. That's absolutely bananas to me. Children, young people have to wait an average of 2 years by the looks of things. This is from looking at the sort of wait lists that are published by the gender identity clinics and the gender identity development services. The latter is for children and young people, the prior is for adults. And the Cass review highlighted, it was a big review, independent review, highlighted that these services are not ideal. They're centralized. They are, nowhere near big enough to account for all of the people who might need to use them. And we need to kind of create more geographically distributed services, more integrated into GP services. I think that was part of the Cass review. But essentially, the core of the review highlighted that we need better access to healthcare for these communities, and that these centralized clinics are not ideal for that purpose. The problem is that what has happened is that children, young people can't really access the clinics right now, not only because the wait list is so long, but also because I think the clinics are in places kind of pausing access, anticipating that there are going to be these geographically more distributed centers or GP integrated clinics or whatever they may end up being, but those services haven't been set out or created. So we have this sort of gap where children, young people are struggling to access the healthcare that they need. So while we don't have the same kind of legislative framework for detransition that's happening in the States, actually in the UK, it's getting harder for people to access healthcare, whether they're adults or children. You may also have seen this kind of rise in protests around Drag Queen Story Hour, considering that both in the US and in the UK, you'll see this kind of rise in protests trying to prevent people from like reading stories to children just because they're gender diverse. Now, yeah, drag queens are gender diverse in terms of how they express themselves in the world, not necessarily in their gender identity, but I don't know why that matters particularly. We know from research that children with siblings who are transgender have an easier time understanding gender diversity in the world around them, and that's because they've had access to it in the past. So we have reason to believe that Drag Queen Story Hour is a great thing because it teaches children that gender is a bit bigger than they might have assumed, and therefore when they come across people who are gender diverse, they're not confused or concerned about it. They're happier. Now, I've been on the receiving end of children who are less well experienced in gender diversity. I got to tell you, that's kind of weird. I'm an educational psychologist. I work with children and young people all the time. And I went to go to a school. I was working with a young person in reception year in a primary school. And I was outside and a child who I wasn't working with wandered up to me. He kind of tottered up to me. He was really smartly dressed. He had his little bow tie on. Impressive. My brother was like that when he was the same age, like little bow tie, extremely smart. And he took a look at me. And I looked at him at the corner of my eye, and he just said, "Are you a boy or a girl?" And I was like, interesting question. I said, "I'm a girl." Hey. And he sort of looked at me with a sort of childlike skepticism. And I looked at him and I was like, if I bury this child in the sandpit, is anybody going to notice? Like, can I run away? Can I flee? Am I about to be bullied by a 4-year-old? And he looked at me and he just said, "I don't believe you." I was like, uh-oh. Okie doke. You go, run away now. Not a problem. That's fine. And I sort of carried on observing the child I was there to see. And he put his hands on his hips. He started to do a dance and he sung, "You're a boy, you're a boy." I got bullied by a 4-year-old in school. I have no idea how that happened. And I looked at him and I was like, they will never find you. Like, I'm burying you in the sandpit. I was like, perfectly. I was like, good on you, kid. I'm actually a girl and I'm over here now. I'm actually a doctor. I'm a professional woman in the world. Damn it. Get out of my face, child. So kids who have had a bit of experience, maybe that kid with a bit of experience of me might next time when they meet somebody who's gender diverse, not bully them. So we think that Drag Queen Story Hour is a good thing, right? Like you meet a drag queen, you realize that they're wonderful people in the world. And then when you meet other gender diverse folk, maybe you're less surprised, less like worried about it. We exist in the world. We're here. Let's get used to it. But you will see the protests that are taking place, huge protests, sometimes armed in the United States, and in the UK, protests at pretty much every Drag Queen Story Hour event. We have a researcher researching Drag Queen Story Hour and the experiences of going to Drag Queen Story Hour events, and our wonderful postgrad researcher had to be escorted out of the back with the drag queen doing the event by police because it was the only way to get them out of the building safely. What kind of place are we living in that's a thing that happened? Now, yeah, loads of counter protests, often bigger than the protests themselves, and the act of attending the event is now something of a protest in and of itself, right? A defiance against what? Against, I'm tempted to say, hatred, bigotry, against concerned people who don't necessarily understand what's happening here, who have a view of gender that cites the idea, and this is what folds all around, when we're talking about access to healthcare and we're talking about Drag Queen Story Hour, when we're talking about like helping children and young people to understand the breadth of gender in the world around them, there's a group of people who have a view of gender which was popularized by psychologists. I'm a psychologist. And we, as a sort of massive discipline of scientists, we popularized the notion that gender was learned rather than discovered. We learned how to do gender in the world, and so we could teach children to be straight or teach them to be gay. We could teach them to be cisgender in the world, i.e. not transgender, and we could teach them to be transgender by how we raised them. And so when it comes to Drag Queen Story Hour, when it comes to transition-related services, when it comes to affirmative care, which just means listening to children and young people and following them when they tell us that they're trans, there's a belief, a view, that that is a form of malleation. It's a way in which children and young people's gender identities are malleated, shaped through their experience in a way that might be problematic. You hear phrases like, we're confusing children. And that comes from that idea that gender identity is shaped rather than discovered, made rather than born. And that's a legitimate question. It's one of the legitimate questions that we together are going to have to tackle. We're going to have to take a look at what the scientific consensus says about what gender identity is. Is it born or is it made? Now, you may also have seen that the UK has just evoked Section 35 to prohibit Scotland's government from changing the Gender Recognition Act to make it easier for transgender folks to change their gender recognition, or to get a gender recognition certificate, which is the means by which solely people who are gender diverse can get access to a legal recognition of their gender, bearing in mind that there isn't really legal recognition for the non-binary community still in the UK, just for transgender folks, really. And the gender recognition certificate is a complicated and quite bureaucratic way of accessing it. And Scotland said, let's make it easier. We'll prevent the need to get multiple doctor's letters, and we'll prevent the need to give a load of documentation for the last 2 years evidencing your gender. And instead, what we will do is just ask people to sign a statutory declaration. And the UK government prevented them from doing it. For the first ever time, prohibited Scotland from using its devolved powers, which tells us something about how transgender people are affected by the sort of continuing legislative frameworks around them. We still have this view that gender is something to be afraid of when it's outside of the norm, rather than a view that gender outside of the norm is kind of expected. Maybe it's a typical part of human experience. So together, we need to answer these two questions. What genders is it possible for a person to be in the world? And two, what makes a person the gender that they are? And we're going to take a look at a bunch of questions around that, like, the rising acceptance of transgender people publicly. Does that confuse people? Does it make more people likely to be transgender? What about support for gender identity within the family or from friends? Is it going to make more people transgender? What about affirmative care? Is it legitimate for us to listen to children and young people when they tell us that they're gender diverse? Is it legitimate for us to listen to adults when they tell us that they're gender diverse? Is this a mental health problem to consider yourself outside of the gendered binary? If you think of yourself as a gender different to the one that you were assigned at birth, is that a mental health problem? Or is that simply a typical part of the diversity of human experience that folds around us? These newfangled genders outside of the norm, there seem to be loads of them and they seem to be super fashionable. Is it just that people are trying to be special in the world? Okay, maybe that one was a bit provocative, but still, we're going to answer these questions as genuine, legitimate scientific questions. We're going to approach them sensitively, we'll approach them together, and we will generate some answers. But before that, we need to focus a little bit on the status quo. We need to understand what is happening around gender in our society because, sure, we might take a look and think, wow, gender's outside of the norm. There are tons of them, and people have wonderful experiences outside of the norm. Gender is beautifully diverse. But before we get there, we need to see the problem, which is that our society doesn't expect that diversity. In fact, the world in which we've created, the world that we have built, really only expects two genders to exist, male and female, and has pretty strong views about how we assign people to those genders. When we come back, we're going to talk more about gender identity, and we're going to talk more about the status quo. What genders does our society expect to exist in the world? See you in a moment.